Hi everyone. It occurred to me that we haven't put too many boogeymen in the spotlight so far on this channel, despite its name. So today we're going to put that right with one of the most well-known aggressive Bigfoot encounters ever recorded, the Siege of Honobia. The story takes us to southeastern Oklahoma, the Kiamichi Mountains. This is the edge of the Wichita National Forest, a long, folded country of pine and hardwood and steep little hollows that doesn't get talked about much, even by people who think they know where the wild parts of America are. It isn't the Pacific Northwest. There are no glaciers here, no 1,000-mile wilderness, but it's old and it's thick, and once you're a few miles off the blacktop, the dark comes down between the trees in a way that makes the distance feel a great deal longer than the map says it is. There's a community out here called Honobia. It's small, close-knit and deeply private. There's a church, a scatter of homes, logging roads that go quiet after dark, and that's it. It's the kind of place people move to precisely because no one will bother them. And somewhere down one of those roads in the winter of 2000, there was a house with a gate, the kind you had to get out of the car to open. It was humble and unpretentious. A family lived there, a family who were appreciative of the peace, the quiet and the old country ways. That was until one night at 2 in the morning, something started knocking on their front door. When they opened it, no one, no thing was there. To understand what happens to that family, and just as importantly, what happens to their story afterwards, it helps to understand the place and the kind of people who choose to live in it. Honobia sits in the Kiamichi Mountains in the far southeast of Oklahoma. It is prime logging country. It's poor in places and it's remote by design. These days, the town is best known, a little awkwardly, for an annual Bigfoot festival, but that came later after these events. It grew out of them. And it's worth being honest about how remote we're really talking. This is a place where some homes didn't get electricity until the 1950s, and where heading east out of town means driving the last unpaved state highway in Oklahoma. It sits in the middle of well over 100,000 acres of commercial timberland, with cedar, oak, pine, and the wild things that move through it. That's hogs, deer, bear, and even the occasional panther. It is exactly the kind of country where a large animal could go about its business almost entirely unseen. And it's exactly the kind of country where a person could walk in and never come out. And the Humphrey family were not the first to feel watched out here, not by a long way. The Choctaw, who have lived in these mountains for generations, have long told of large, hair-covered beings in the Kiamichi, and those stories are still held by Choctaw families in the surrounding communities today. One woman from nearby Watson remembered her grandparents' account of a small boy who wandered into the forest and was lost, and who, when he was finally found, was unharmed and said only that thing had looked after him. A Choctaw man from Honobia itself has described his own encounter as a boy back in the 1950s. He and 2 friends were messing about near an unfinished bridge over the Little River one Sunday evening when they heard the steel groan above them. They looked up and saw something tall and hair-covered rise onto 2 legs. Understandably, they ran. But by his account, it followed them all the way to his grandmother's cabin and pushed at the door 2 or 3 times before it left. I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of material that gets flattened into spooky local colour, and it deserves better than that. These aren't campfire inventions just dressed up for a festival. They're accounts held within a community and passed down by families, told by named people with no particular appetite for ridicule. And they describe with some consistency the same kind of thing the Humphreys would describe decades later. It's a feeling and circumstance I keep running into it on this channel. When something turns up in a culture's stories for generations, I think you're at least entitled to ask why and how. The family at the centre of this were two brothers and their father. The brothers had grown up running around in the woods as kids, and when they had children of their own, that was the life they wanted to give them. Land, trees, and space without interference. So, they bought adjacent parcels out in the mountains, a 30-acre piece and a smaller one alongside it, perhaps a quarter of a mile between the two houses. By every account, these were not naive people, and they were not, as some stories would later be told, a pair of hillbillies blazing away at shadows. They were capable, articulate, and they knew the woods. There were food plots on the property, particularly Austrian winter peas, the kind of thing deer will walk a long way for, and there was already a serious deer population in the area generally, which was good for a family that hunted. Like many, they'd hang carcasses to cure in an open shed and keep meat through the winter. And that's a detail you're going to want to hold on to, because it became the hinge on which two very different versions of this story turn and are told. One more thing about the culture out here, and I want to be careful with it rather than make a caricature of it. People in this part of Oklahoma do not, as a rule, call the law if they can avoid it. There are reasons for that, some of them to do with how thinly the area is policed, and some of it goes into the history and what else goes on in those hills sometimes. So when something started coming to this house at night, the family didn't dial for help. They handled it the way people out there handle things. They armed themselves and they waited. The trouble is, what they were waiting for didn't behave like anything they knew how to confront. The clearest version of what this family went through doesn't come from the official report. It comes from their own account. As I've already said, the family name is Humphreys, and the account comes from the brothers, Tim and Michael, who later sat down and gave the whole thing at length to Wes Germer on the Sasquatch Chronicles podcast. I'll leave a link to that in the below. I want to flag right at the top that this is an eyewitness account, and in part it was also relayed by a friend. We'll weigh it properly in a moment. But it's the fullest first-hand telling we have, and I think it deserves to be heard the way they told it before anyone starts tidying it up. By Mike's account, it began quietly with two daytime sightings. The first one he couldn't place at all. It was a large, upright figure. His mind simply refused to file under any animal he knew. By the second, he'd concluded it was something monstrous, the kind of thing you only mention in whispers. And he didn't tell his brother at this stage. And if you've got a sibling, I think you'll understand why. Some things just aren't worth the years of ridicule. But then it came to the houses. It started small, a knock at the front door at 2 in the morning, and nothing there when they opened it. For the first few times, he genuinely wondered whether it had been something he'd just dreamt. But it escalated and it took on a rhythm. These things, whatever they were, came after midnight and they left before dawn, banging on the walls, throwing rocks out of the dark, and then a face at the bedroom window. And even through the windows were high off the ground, whatever was looking in had to stoop down to do it. It went from once or twice a week to every single night. Mike said he more or less stopped sleeping, and I think we can understand the stress he was going through. And there was never just one thing. The family could hear others chattering, screaming, moving on the hillside while one came in close. And it was the children who had the worst of it, at least to start. The kids would be out playing in the pasture between the house and the tree line, and 3 or 4 of these things would come to the edge of the trees and growl at them, shake the branches of trees, and even throw rocks until the children ran inside, normally white-faced with the only word they had for it, monsters. Then a sister visited with her own 2 young kids and was driven back to the car at the gate under a hail of rocks. A niece was also cornered getting out of her own car and described one of them leaning down to the big front window of the house, tall as the guttering, and it was peeling its lips back off its teeth at her through the glass. I think we can all agree this isn't friendly behaviour or benign. Eventually, Mike's wife took their children and went to stay with family. She'd understandably had enough. And her message to the 2 men was simple: make these things go away. Meanwhile, to make matters worse, the family's food larder was disappearing. 5 deer carcasses gone from the shed in a single night, not scattered, taken. And then 30 chickens gone from the coop by morning, along with the eggs and a trail of broken emptied shells leading back into the woods. Whatever this was, it was feeding off them. And that's a lot of food to lose for a family living off the land with the nearest store the better part of an hour away. Yet, for a long time, that was the shape of it. They almost accepted that they were a family besieged by something that raided their food and worked on their nerves in the dark. But it stopped short of coming through the door or being more aggressive than that. But then came a night that changed the nature of the whole thing. One of the creatures had come up close and gone through its usual routine, pacing, growling, throwing rocks, and Tim, at this point, decided he'd had enough, and he went out after it. It ran, and he fired. By his account, he hit it 3 times, and it went down hard, not far from the house, perhaps 70 yards into the dark. And what they're clear about is that they heard it die. I'm not going to romanticize that or linger on it. It was, by their description, an ugly, drawn-out death, and they stood on the porch and listened to it. And then something happened that I think is the single most important detail in the entire case. They didn't get the body. As the brothers moved toward it, because their intention was to retrieve it, they were rushed out of the dark by several more of the creatures. One of them lifted the dead one, picked it up bodily, and carried it away over a shoulder while the others covered the retreat. They would not leave their dead behind, which is something regularly reported. And here's the part that inverts everything. Up to that night, by Mike's account, nothing had actually tried to get into the house. The raids were on the shed, the coop, and their nerves. It was only after they killed one that the creatures began, in earnest, trying to get inside, with the doors, the windows, and coming for the people inside specifically. Mike's reading of it was not subtle and not, I think, hysterical, given what he'd just lived through. He believed it had stopped being about food and it had become wholly focused on them. So, what do we actually do with that? Let's start with the behaviour because it's the part that's hardest to set down, whatever you think the animal was. If you take the family's account at face value, these creatures did several things that sit a long way past simple instinct. They appeared to lure. The big one would pace and provoke and then retreat slowly toward the tree line, drawing the brothers out, and when they followed, Mike said he could hear 4 or 5 others spread in a U shape in the dark on either side of them. He came to believe, quite understandably, that it was a trap. Then they also defended and recovered their dead, as we saw. As a group of animals, they learned the family's defences. When Mike set out motion sensor lights, he later found sticks laid in a line, marking the exact trigger point so the things could move behind it without setting the lights off. That's something I actually borrowed from my own Bigfoot horror novel, Rogue, because I think it's genuinely horrifying, and it isn't behaviour unique to this case either. After he cleared away the sticks, he woke to find every sensor turned to point uselessly at the sky. Again, they're working their way around the problem. And most unsettling of all, the creatures were able to mimic. One day, with Mike away at work, his father and brother heard Mike's own voice out in the woods, calling the dogs the way he always did. But of course it wasn't Mike. He was miles away. Now, regular viewers will know roughly where I sit on animal emotional intelligence, and it's not where a lot of people assume. I don't think the cautious scientific position is to wave all of this away as dumb instinct. The cautious position, increasingly, is to admit that the inner lives of animals are richer and stranger than we spent a century telling ourselves. So, I'm not going to stand here and tell you an animal, if indeed Bigfoot is an animal, can't lure, can't grieve it's dead, can't problem solve, and can't learn a man's voice. Crows manage versions of some of that. We also know that chimpanzees are great problem solver. In fact, from octopuses to birds and bats, there's many forms of animals that show emotional intelligence, that, similar to what we're talking about here. And this is the discipline, none of that tells us this animal exists. There is a difference between this behaviour, if it happened, points to real intelligence, and saying conclusively that it did happen. Although it does sound feasible and very detailed, with a grasp of animal behaviour that goes well beyond the norm if it really was just invented. I also did a whole episode on a case that rhymes with this one, almost note for note, the case of the amber, the Amur tiger in the Russian Far East, that, by the physical evidence, waited days at a poacher's cabin and then hunted down the man who had wronged it. The thing that made that story unsettling wasn't the violence. It was the shape of it, the harm, and then a response that looked for all the world like retribution. Honobia has exactly that shape. There's a killing and then, in short, a war. It looks and feels like revenge, doesn't it? The enormous difference, is that with the tiger, we had the body, the tracks, the cabin, the forensics, and ultimately the animal itself. With Honobia, we have a family's word. However compelling, we do have to scrutinise the story. Open-minded scepticism is healthy. For instance, we should ask ourselves why animals so large and powerful couldn't get into the house if they really wanted to. Maybe there is something that truly prevents them from crossing that boundary, as some researchers suggest, but there's no evidence for that, yet. But this is a multi-year, multiple encounter testimony escalating in drama and stress, and that escalation comes through clearly in the Humphreys telling. If this didn't happen, then they are decent actors and very committed ones to the tune of decades. I have a good deal of sympathy for their position, of course I do, but what we're left with evidentially is testimony. And for a long time, I have just said that that was nearly all of it. A coherent, consistent narrator and a handful of relatives backing up the worst of the nights. Except it isn't quite all. Because a few years later, a regional newspaper went up into those mountains and they found some named locals, woodsmen, loggers, a retired forestry man, all willing to put their names to what they'd seen and heard out there, ridicule and all. One logger said he walked out to the spot the morning after the shooting and saw blood flung high up on the tree trunks over a couple of 100 yards, where the body had supposedly been carried off. That's independent corroboration from people with nothing to gain and a lot of mockery to lose. Again, I'll put links to this in the notes. But notice what it still isn't. It's still not a body. There's no clear footage. That's despite the fact that Mike said he had photographs and video, but saw no point in releasing any of it because the forums had already savaged the family and because, in his view, it would take a body to prove anything anyway. By the next day, the rain had taken the blood and the investigators found nothing but a mutilated deer where the creature was said to have fallen. Consistent, independent testimony, and not one thing we could put on a table, is what we're ultimately left with. I don't put much stake in the suggestion that these were misidentified bears. This is a family who hunt and live and breathe a life on the land. I think we should be clear that to suggest they don't know what a bear looks like, even in the dark, is, in my view, a little disrespectful. And the behaviour described simply isn't bear-like. We'll be looking at some famous bear attacks in a future video, and the differences are very clear. I understand that sustained terror in an isolated household can compound and reshape what people perceive night after night, year after year. It's understandable. But the very human habit of finding pattern and intent in chaos is also real. But sometimes I think it takes more of a leap of faith to believe these so-called logical alternatives than it does to credit what was actually described. Which brings me to the part of the case I find generally the most interesting, and it isn't a monster. It's what happened to the story and how it got treated by different parties. If you read the account of Honobia that's been the standard one for years, the write-up by the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organisation, also known as the BFRO, who sent people out at the time, you get a much tidier tale. In that version, this is essentially an ecology problem. The family planted those winter peas to pull deer in, the deer pulled in some nuisance animals after an easy meal, and once the family cleared the attractant, the deer left, the creatures left, and the whole thing resolved itself. It's neat, it's tidy, and explicable. And quietly, there's also that suggestion that it was all a little bit of the family's own fault. Mike's answer to that version is blunt and specific and worth taking seriously. He says the peas were on the land when they bought it and are still there now. They planted nothing to bait anything. The creatures, he says, were never primarily after the food, and the proof of that is the timeline. The real attempts to get into the house started after the killing, not over the venison. And that tidy resolution that the BFRO suggested? Apparently, according to Mike, it didn't happen. By his account, nothing ever fully left. There was still activity there years later, the deer never left, and the creatures never left. I can't obviously adjudicate that for you with certainty, but I can tell you we have two accounts in direct conflict, and they conflict in a revealing direction. One was recorded by an organisation with a settled idea of what a Sasquatch is and how it behaves, a flesh and blood animal following a food source. And it does read as though the events were filed to fit that idea. The other comes from the people it actually happened to, who felt, in their own words, that they hadn't called for researchers at all. They'd called for help. They wanted the things gone, taken care of. They didn't want them studied. And that's what they got, in their own telling, an offer to buy the property for long-term observation. A hunter in his 70s who spent most of the visit asleep in the car. And investigators so unnerved on the first night that they tried to pack up and leave. And then the family came to believe they were sold out, that it was in fact the BFRO and researchers who tipped off the state game department and the press, which is what finally put official eyes on the property and stopped the family doing anything at all. I'm also going to be straight with you about the next layer of this story because it's there in the account and I don't want to quietly launder it out or skip over it. Over the years, Mike's belief hardened into something closer to a cover-up. He describes an unmarked car at his phone box, a tapped phone line, a conviction that the truth about a North American primate is being actively suppressed because confirming it would shut down the timber industry and gut the regional economy. And it's here that I'm going to step out from behind the evidence and just tell you what I think, which is that I've never been convinced these cover-up and conspiracy ideas hold up. I'm really sorry. I don't. That's because the economics people reach for don't make sense. The figures, when you actually look at them, are wildly off. And then the government is hiding it to protect logging jobs is precisely the kind of frame people reach for when they've been disbelieved and badly treated for years, which this family unquestionably was. I can hold real sympathy for how they were treated and still say plainly, the cover-up reasoning is the weakest part of the whole account and I don't really buy it. I recently saw a military officer say he can't stop his Joes from telling their girlfriends about high-value targets the night before an op. We know that government leaks happen all the time. So, a conspiracy that requires multiple departments and agencies to work together in perfect unison and total secrecy for decades, with nothing ever leaked, accounted for, or budgeted, well, I'd need a great deal more than a shot in the dark to believe it. In the words of Sherlock Holmes, we should avoid insensibly twisting facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. But, as you know, I like a Sherlock Holmes quote. At the same time, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And the strange thing is that none of it actually touches the observations. Because a man can be entirely wrong about why the world is the way it is, and still have accurately described the thing that came to his window. And that, in the end, is what Honobia is really about for me. More than the creatures, more than the gunfire, it's about what happens to an account when it doesn't fit the box it gets filed in, as so many of these accounts do. A family lived through something they found genuinely terrifying, something that, by their telling, was intelligent, social, vengeful, and far stranger than a hungry animal just raiding a shed. And by the time that experience had passed through the people who came to investigate it, it had been smoothed into a wildlife management anecdote with a clean ending. The fear, the monstrosity, the paranormal was edited out. The retaliation was edited out. The part where it stopped being about food and started being about them was edited out. I'm not saying the family's version is the literal, unvarnished truth and that the researchers lied. I'm saying that the gap between the two is possibly the most honest thing in the whole case. Somewhere in that gap is whatever actually happened in those mountains in 2000. and we can't quite reach it. Partly because there's no body, and partly because the official record we inherited was written by people who had already decided what they expected to find. And here's the bitter little joke of it. The family were laughed at. The news crews came and they made it campy. The locals swore they'd never go on camera again. The Humphreys themselves, in the end, were gone. And then the town built a festival on it, a festival that became Honobia's identity and very nearly its economy. The story that nobody would take seriously became the one the whole town is now known for. Which leaves the question this channel keeps circling back to, and one we can never quite close or answer. When something behaves the way these things were said to behave, when it waits and learns and carries off its dead and comes back for the man who wronged it, where does that instinct end and become something else? And how would we ever know? Ultimately, the family didn't stay to be proven right. But by the earliest accounts, they left in a hurry. There was food still in the kitchen, the furniture was still in the rooms, and the people who knew them tell different stories to this day about where they went. As I've said a number of times, we don't have the body that would settle it. We have a tidy report that explains it away, and a frightened, articulate man who says the report is wrong about nearly everything that really mattered. I can't tell you which to believe. I can only tell you that I find the man more convincing than the file, which by itself proves nothing at all, I know. Thanks as always for watching. I really appreciate it. If you got something out of this one, a like genuinely helps, as does a share, and I'd of course would love for you to subscribe, because there's a companion piece coming on a strikingly similar siege over in Kentucky, the incident known as the Spotsville Monster, where the family ended up taking to the roof of their own house, and where the official explanation was, if anything, even harder to swallow. And if you like this blend of real predators, folklore, and the uneasy ground in between, you'll find more of it in my books on Amazon and Audible. And especially right now, look out for Dark Tides, my new standalone eco-thriller, which is out now and available on Amazon. But until next time, thanks always for watching, and join me again very soon. Thanks for bearing with me through the heat wave. I'm going to try and get a few more videos up over the next few weeks to make up for it. But as I say, I'll see you all again very soon. Thanks for watching.